Hello, and thanks for joining today's lecture with Dr. Carolyn Finney, brought to you by the New York Botanical Gardens Humanities Institute. My name is Charles Zimmerman, and co-hosting with me today is Raquel Nazario from NYBG. At any time, please feel welcome to type questions by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your window, and our host will raise these for our speaker to answer at the end. To enable live captions in English, click the closed captions button, then click Show Subtitles. Live captions are also available in Spanish and Chinese through an external link which is provided in the chat. As a reminder, this presentation will be recorded and shared in the NYBG Lecture Library. Now I will let Raquel Nazario introduce our speaker for the day.
Thank you, Charles, and welcome to the New York Botanical Gardens Humanities Institute lecture, supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We're so grateful to have you join us from locations across the United States and around the world for today's talk, Black Faces, White Spaces, Christian Cooper, John Muir, and Reclaiming a Green World. I am Raquel Nazario, Chief Diversity Officer for the Botanical Garden, and it is my pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Carolyn Finney, who will explore the complexities and contradictions of her past and present as they relate to green space, race, and the power to shape places we live in. Carolyn Finney is an inspiring storyteller, author, and a cultural geographer. She is deeply interested in issues related to identity, difference, creativity, and resilience. Dr. Finney completed a BA and an MA on gender and environmental issues in Kenya and Nepal, respectively. She earned her PhD with a concentration on African Americans and environmental issues in the US. Dr. Finney has been a Fulbright Scholar, a Canon National Science Scholar, a Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow, and is currently Scholar in Residence in the Franklin Environmental Center at Middlebury College. Along with consulting for a variety of environmental, educational, and art-based nonprofits, for 8 years she served on the U.S. National Parks Advisory Board, which assists the National Park Service in building relationships of reciprocity with diverse communities. Her first book, Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors, was released in 2014. Here, with us now, is Dr. Carolyn Finney.
Raquel, thank you for that. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming here today. First, I have to thank Vanessa Sellers. I have to thank Charles Zimmerman. I have to thank Raquel Nazario. I have to thank everyone at the Botanical Gardens for reaching out and asking me to come speak with you all today. I only wish I could see all your faces. I feel it's really important to acknowledge that today is 9/11, and we all lost something that day, but particularly those who lost loved ones that day. So I just wanted to bring that up, bring that in the room. Okay, so here's the deal, right? For the next 50 minutes or so, I'm gonna share some stories. I'm gonna pull stuff from my book. I'm gonna talk about issues related to the environment and the outdoors, and more particularly race. I'm gonna tell some personal stuff. I'm gonna tell some historical stuff. And I'm hoping that you all lean in for that. We'll have some time afterwards, about 20, 25 minutes for questions. And actually for me, that's often where the real magic happens. I wanna say to you that I want that all questions are good questions today for this period of time for me. I'm less interested in whether or not you agree with me. I'm more interested in you actually just participating, leaning in, and considering some of the things that I'm saying. I wrote a couple of things down. So when you see me look down, it's just that I'm kind of looking at my notes before I go too far afield, as I tend to do. I was thinking about and talking a few weeks ago with some landscape architects in Indiana, and I was remembering when my friend and the Black poet Nikki Finney had said to me a few years ago when we were driving around the state of Kentucky. She was talking about how architects, often when they build a building, they create a pathway to the building. So it might be an office building, it might be a school, but people often don't take the path that's there for them. They carve their own path. And she said that architects call that a desire line. And I love that. I love that idea that we carve our own path, hopefully, based on what we desire. But one of the things that when I think about the issue of race here, I say, what does that mean? Because carving your own path means your ability to claim your own place. So what does that mean or look like in a country where race has been used to define the measure of your humanity? And that's just real, right? That's not just real today. That's not just real when George Floyd was murdered a couple of months ago. That's not just real when Christian Cooper tried to walk through a park in New York City right before that. It was real 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 400 years ago. It's a truth that we have never been able to get away from, right? And in part for me, it is because we have never fully reconciled the impact of that, not just on Black people, but on everybody, and our ability to have a good and strong and real and authentic relationship with each other. So I want to talk about a couple of things around that. I'm put up some images here. Yeah. So I've been thinking also about the term self-evident, and I looked it up in the Collins English Dictionary. So I'm reading the quote as it's written in the Collins English Dictionary. Self-evident is defined as, quote, a fact or situation that is self-evident is so obvious that there is no need for proof or explanation. A fact or situation that is self-evident is so obvious that there is no need for proof or explanation. Now, I'm thinking about the pandemic, and not everybody actually believes that's actually happening. But for many of us, the proof is real, sometimes for our very bodies as well as people that we care about. We've all seen, most of us have seen the video of the murder of George Floyd. It's pretty self-evident. We may have our own opinions about what it means, but we know it happened. But the other thing is, and 9/11, we all saw that as well. That happened, right? Even if we don't all agree about what it means and how it happened. The thing is, I've been thinking about it in terms of Black people, and Black people on the landscape, Black people in place. And for many of us, if not for most of us, we're always having to prove and affirm the fact that we are self-evident. We are evident. Why, instead of having to explain ourselves, to describe ourselves, to assimilate ourselves, to sometimes erase ourselves as a way to be present and be able to say we belong here, that we're not always self-evident, even though for me, in my heart, we always are. And for me, it doesn't make a difference if you're talking about being in nature, right? One of the things that I find interesting about this country and my own love for and involvement in everything environmental, so whatever that means, whatever those conversations look like, is that there has been some resistance to the idea that somehow, yes, we can talk about Jim Crow segregation, we can talk about, you know, driving while Black, running while Black, all the things you can do while Black and what will happen to you. But somehow, when it shifts over to thinking about a park or a green space, you know, being outdoors at the beach, climbing or hiking in the mountains, somehow all of that just falls away. And I'm here to tell you, even just with my own experience as a Black person who has been privileged to backpack around the world and live in Nepal and get to do all these things, there was not one time that I was never Black, right? And I was always reminded of it. Sometimes it was really friendly. Sometimes it was about, wow, where are you from? What? I'm so unusual to see you here. Sometimes it's like that. And sometimes it's less friendly because I've even been called the N-word, right? So to really understand that nature, as we describe it as something outside of ourselves, isn't this immune to what's been happening socially with us for the last 400 years. It spills over to that and actually emerges often, you know, in very particular ways. Also, it's important to remember for me that, you know, I always say there's always two truths about our country. I'm going to come back to that in a second, actually. I'm going to come back to those two truths in a minute. So, yeah, so I really want to say that nature isn't separate and that we have always been self-evident. This was a picture that was on the New York Botanical Gardens website, and I want to explain this picture a little bit to sort of make my point. That's my mother. She's walking. This is down in Floyd, Virginia. This was maybe 10 years ago. My parents are originally from Virginia. They grew up there. They were poor, high school education. But 10 years ago, the whole family, we drove down there because a lot of my mother's relatives still lived there, some of my father's. And as we drove into Floyd, my father wanted to make a stop. And we had to ask, we saw a white farmer on a tractor, and we had to ask his permission to come on his property because this land that you're looking at here was his property. But that enclosed little piece of land that you're seeing there right in the center of the picture, that is where my father's parents, his brothers, and many of his relatives are buried, right? And it's a complicated story over time, how that land, how his family lost ownership of that land. But the thing that moved me so much was that my father had to ask permission to go visit. Now, the white farmer was friendly. He said, of course, come on in. You can see that that land is protected, but it hasn't been kept up. So we weren't allowed to go in because there were snakes and other things there. And so I think about the question of who is self-evident and who is not. And what does it mean when you can't even visit your family on land because it doesn't belong to you, even though your family's remains lay there. The other thing that I always have to start off doing is, everybody who's heard me before, I always say a couple of things. One, that all knowledge is subjective. Everything that we're trying to understand in this world is based on how we perceive the world through our own eyes. That includes mine as well. We are all biased. I'm biased, you're biased. Everybody on this video today is biased, right? And bias is not the same as prejudice and racism, though, man, it is a close cousin. And I think you really have to sort of police that to understand when that can sort of shift over. So for me, it's always interesting when I come to talk about a thing and I am the thing itself. I'm really here, we know, to talk about race and the environment in the current climate that we're all living in. And I'm Black. Right? So that's going to mean something to me. This is personal for me. It's political for me. It's intimate for me. My hope and wish is that it was that way for everyone, right? What does it mean? So I always have to start off a little bit with my own story to give you some transparency about how I'm situated and come to talk about some of the stories from my book and talk about this a little more broadly and historically. So that's me. That's me back in 1962, the good old days, looking a bit confused, not so different than today. And that's my dad in the background. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this estate that we lived on in a minute. Here's some more pictures of that moment. So there are my parents, Henry and Rose. That was taken in the late 50s. So I told you that my parents grew up in Floyd, Virginia, poor. It was segregated at the time. And when my dad came back from the Korean War, he decided that, like a lot of Black people who lived in the South, that he'd have a better chance of getting a job if he moved north. He told me a story a few years ago that when he first came back, that he saw a park ranger in a park ranger uniform. And in his mind, that looked like a good government job in the state of Virginia. So he went to apply. But what he was told was that they don't hire Negroes. So they moved north. And when they got to New York, and they had two job offers. My dad could be a janitor in Syracuse, New York. For a lot of you New Yorkers, it's just about 5 hours right north of New York City. But the other was 30 minutes outside of New York City in Westchester County. So, Grand Central, Metro North, you get off in Mamaroneck, not far down the street from Yonkers. And that's the job my father took. So the job it was a very wealthy Jewish family that many New Yorkers might know as well, the Tishmans. They owned this 12-acre estate. And this is some of the pictures of that estate. Beautiful. A pond, a swimming pool, vegetable gardens, fruit trees, stunning, stunning, stunning. They needed full-time caretakers on this estate, in part because they didn't live there full-time. So my parents took that job. My dad was the chauffeur. He was the gardener, the caretaker. My mom was the sometime housekeeper because there's a second house on the property. So the house you're seeing here is the gardener's cottage, which is where my family lived. This is and was a very wealthy all-white neighborhood at the time. When I say very wealthy, at the time, Harry Winston had property down the street. Wingfoot Golf Club was around the corner. Schaefer of Schaefer Beer lived next door. We were the only family of color in this neighborhood until the 90s. At that point, a Japanese American woman moved in. She was there for a few years, and then she left. So you get some feeling about what it was like to live in this neighborhood, or imagine that. And this was, when my parents moved there, it was late 50s, right? So you're looking at the 50s, 60s, 70s, when me and my brothers lived there as well and were growing up there. So my parents wanted to have kids, and they thought they couldn't have kids. And thanks to the Tishmans, they were able to adopt me from Spence Chapin, which is still there in New York City. It's a Jewish adoption agency. So they adopted me. You see me there in my little Easter outfit. I was actually about 2 years old in that earlier picture. And then what I always like to say is that my parents relaxed, and they had my first brother, Greg. And then a few more years went by, some more relaxing happened, and they had my second brother, John. So me and my brothers, you know, during the week, the Tishman family wasn't always there. And so during the week, we played on this land. It was like our own private park. By the time we were 7, we all knew how to swim. We had to know how to swim, right? Because there was water on this property, and my parents couldn't always keep an eye on us because, you know, we were kids. So we knew how to swim. The story that people have heard me tell, because it's really, I could tell a lot of stories about what it was like to grow up on this land, and the privilege, I will say, of having access to this outdoors, and how much it shaped how I think about the outdoors and nature and place in very particular ways. But this experience that I had, that I'm going to tell you about in a second, also shaped that experience. So because you had so much wealth in this neighborhood, you always had policemen patrolling this neighborhood. My brothers and I went to a public school, Mamaroneck Public School, which was largely, I would say, Italian-American working class. You had some African-American working class. And so I could walk home from school. And at that time, you didn't think anything about letting a small kid walk home. It was maybe 15 minutes to walk home. And I was right around the corner from the house, literally right around the corner from the house. And a policeman was in his car. It's just a 2-lane road, you know, one lane going each way. And he stopped me. He asked me where I was going, and I gave him the address. I said 1000 Old White Plains Road. And then he just looked at me and said, "Oh, do you work there?" You know, I was thinking, I'm 9 years old. What's he talking about? And all I said was, "No, I live there," because I was just confused. And he said, "Oh, excuse me," and he let me go. I remember going home, telling my parents. My father got so angry, he called the police station, and he really gave it to him. And they never bothered me or my brothers again. But as an adult, I have to think about the logics of that. What were the logics? He didn't stop to say, like, "Are you okay? Do you need some help? Do you know where you're going to get home?" Because I was a little girl, 9, school bag, time of day, all the logics were in place. But something, and I'll never know what was going on through his head, but he had to challenge my right and my ability to be there at that time. I want to jump ahead. This is a little side thing. I realize I have this. So this is what I like to say is, this used to be on the signpost there. And I like to say one of my brothers liberated this when my parents finally left, but I don't know, I maybe shouldn't have shared that. It's on video, but here it is. And I keep it with me on my desk. I want to jump ahead to the 90s. So Mr. Tishman had passed away earlier on, but in the 90s, Mrs. Tishman got very sick. And the question was, what's going to happen to my parents? Now, my parents at this point had been caring for that land, living on it full time for nearly 40 years. And to her credit, she was thinking about, can she keep them on this land? The property was worth over $3 million at that time. The property taxes were over $125,000 a year. My father, he was probably making something, I remember he said like 20,000, something like 25,000 a year. So there was no way that was going to happen, even with Mrs. Tishman's help. The relationship between my father and Mrs. Tishman, the Tishman family, is complicated. I know she had my father by her bedside when she died, right? So it's complicated, right? So she had a house built for them, and they chose Leesburg, Virginia. My father swore he was never going back to the state of Virginia. He had so much animosity to the state, and I would say to the country as well, for what he feels they've done to him as a Black man. But my youngest brother at this point was married and living there. Me and my other brother were moving around way too much to choose a place. So they had a house built there, and the house is beautiful. So Mrs. Tishman eventually passed away. A new owner came on, and my parents stayed on the land. They stayed on the land till 2003. They had to stay on the land because there always has to be full-time caretakers for this estate. So they had to find somebody new. Now, my parents have been on the land almost 50 years. They finally found a family that I believe was originally from the Dominican Republic, who then moved in. My parents moved out. When they moved out in 2003, and this is when I was back in school and I was working on my doctorate and thinking a lot about these issues about land and belonging, I watched my father in particular get incredibly depressed because he talked about home. This was home. New York was home. This land was his home. He talked about not having any land to pass down to his kids. And it didn't matter how many times I said to him, that doesn't matter, that doesn't matter. It mattered to him. Then my parents received a copy of a letter, and the letter was from the Westchester Conservation Land Trust. And the letter had gone out to all the surrounding neighbors of this estate to let them know that a conservation easement had been placed on this estate. And when a conservation easement is placed on an estate, that means in perpetuity, nothing can be changed. And they talked about all the values, the environmental values of the state and why it was important to protect it, right? They talked about the wildlife. They talked about where the property sits in the watershed. They talked about all the flora and fauna. They talked about everything. At the end of the letter, and I have a copy of the letter, it's about 1.5 pages long with some really lovely photos of the estate. It thanked the new owner for his conservation mindedness. There was nothing in the letter thanking my parents who had cared for that land for 50 years. There was nothing. And just that fast, they were erased. They were gone from that environmental history. They were gone from that history of place. They were gone. They lost the ability to claim any knowledge. And it's not just about their labor on that place. It is about their love for that place. And to understand, right, that it isn't just about my parents. It's also about me. It's about my brothers. And then I started thinking about this country and the history of all the people that have been erased, all the people that have been forgotten, all the people who have been ignored. Oh, we can't even go down that road when we're talking about Native Americans, right? But let's just talk about Black people or Asian, people of Asian descent or of Latinx descent. I mean, we have so many people who have come here, who are here today, who love the land, who want to claim their place and claim that place as part of who they are, as their home, and they are not allowed to do so for a myriad of reasons. And it is convenient. It is often convenient for many of us who are in a position of privilege, which doesn't make us bad people, but we are in a position of privilege just to ignore that because privilege has a privilege of not seeing itself, right? And I know that's hard to hear, but for me, if we're not willing and honest about that, and I say that with the greatest amount of love and respect for you, and I can't even see you, right? But I understand that. And I've got to tell you, imagine what it feels like for all the people who for 400 years have been erased in any conversation about land, green, beaches, rivers, mountains. And we have always been here just like everybody else. So for me, right, that's the big house behind. So you can start to see the pool there. And now there's a gate, all right, in front of the driveway that was added after we moved out. For me, you know, I ask the question when we say public lands, what public are we talking about? It's like we the people. What people are we talking about? Who is the we, right? How do we honor the diversity, the difference? And what does that honoring, if we're really authentic about it, what does that actually require from us? Because there's some seriously painful stuff that we have to address. So I think a lot about how this is a moment of convergence, right? I think a lot about, well, I feel like we've always had a moment of convergence, but I don't know about the rest of you, but back in 2019, back in the before times, I could have never seen this happening. I could have never seen the pandemic. I could have never seen the fact that, like many of you, I'm working at home, and I'm privileged to even be able to do that, but I'm working at home. And then I could have never seen that within 2 or 3 days of each other, Christian Cooper, an African-American, a gay African-American birder would be walking through a park in New York City, and a white woman named Amy Cooper would weaponize his skin color against him, right? And then just 2 or 3 days later, yet another Black person, George Floyd, would be murdered by a police person or police officer. And then what happened after that? Like, I'm having these conversations more than I ever had before. And I got to tell you, I was on a plane nearly every week before, but now it has exploded. So for me, it's a moment of convergence, which for me always means a moment of opportunity. So you look at the different images I have there, right? And I've got all these images of somebody, you know, enslaved, the idea of immigrants trying to cross the border, the question of Japanese internment, native removal, the pollution happening to our lands. But one of the pictures I have right up there at the top, when I look at the screen, it's to my right, is a really famous picture of John Muir and President Roosevelt. And this was 1903. This was 1903 on Overhanging Rock in Yosemite National Park in California. So look, here's what I imagine. These were two very thoughtful, smart, and committed individuals, right? I ain't taking away nothing from them, right? That they were not committed and thoughtful and smart, right? I wonder what kind of conversation they were having, right? They were thinking about national parks and wilderness and these ideas of conservation. That's Gifford Pinchot, actually, who coined the term conservation, the idea we can manage these resources for our use. They're doing this all at the same time. And I'm thinking, wow, that's really powerful, and it's affected all of us in very particular ways. But then I have to ask myself, but what was going on for everybody else in the late 1800s when Gifford was having these thoughts? When the early 1900s, when John Muir and President Roosevelt were having those thoughts and making policy decisions and making decisions for all of us that, you know, we're all still learning in school about the environment in a very particular way here in this country, because those three men set it up that way. They're not bad or good, right? Bad or good for me is not a useful conversation, but they did just that. So let's back up a little bit farther. So in 1862, you have the Homestead Act. I never thought about the Homestead Act before doing this research, before coming to this subject matter. Now I think it's one of our most important pieces of legislation when we talk about environment, and more importantly, when we talk about land. Because in 1862, when that gun went off at midnight, for the most part, if you were a European immigrant, you got to go out on that land, put a stake down up to 160 acres. And if you stayed on that land for 5 years, you farmed, and you built a structure, if you survived those 5 years, that land was yours, free and clear. That can't happen anywhere else anymore. I want to think about that. I want to think about the fact that for many of those European immigrants, they didn't survive. Something like 60% of them didn't make it, because that's really hard work. I can't imagine what it was like for them to leave their homeland. What a risk. Right? What courage it must have taken, what deep sense of faith it must have taken to come over to this country, which at that time was a lot of wilderness, right, in their minds, and take a stab at creating something, creating their own desire line, right, for themselves and their family. So I don't want to belittle them or diminish their experience. But the fact of the matter is, I can't talk about their experience without considering all the native people that had to be either killed or removed in order for that land to become available, right? Let's go 3 years later. 3 years later, Emancipation Proclamation, enslaved Africans are freed. They're given 400,000 acres. And in no time, white plantation owners started to think about that. They said, oh my God, we just gave 400,000 acres to people we had enslaved. We can't do that, because land isn't just about land. It is about legacy. It is about political and economic power. It is about the right to be able to claim your place and say you belong. Create your own desire line, just how you would like to do it. I don't think so. And they took all that land back. You did have some African-American homesteaders, but nowhere near the number that you had European homesteaders at that time. So these things are going on parallel at the same time. I'm thinking about Jim Crow. Jim Crow extended from what, late 1800s, right up to the early 1900s, all the way to 1965, legally, right? There are, I think after 1965, sundown towns, there are all kinds of things that were happening. And some would argue even still today, spaces that driving while black, walking while black, neighborhoods, I mean, places that you have to think twice about. Not because it's a new thing, because it's an old thing that we have never fully attended to. What does that mean? How do we converge upon this moment in a very particular way? Yeah, I'm gonna have some really good, fun stories, but to get at those, I think we have to go here first, right? And I just love this James Baldwin quote, so I always put it up there. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. I know people say things like, well, slavery was so long ago. Really? Really? There are reasons why people around the country are protesting. There's also reasons why Black people keep dying. There's reasons why we still don't see, we're looking at leaderships of companies, we're looking at Hollywood, we're looking at environmental nonprofits, and why we're still seeing predominantly white people in those positions. There is nothing wrong with those people. That is not what I'm saying. But that is not who we the people are, right? And actually, I would argue that is never who we the people have ever been, right? So at this moment for me is, how do we think about what has happened in the past as a way to acknowledge, to reconcile? You know, we can have a conversation about, is it about reparations? Is it about decolonization? Is it about, what is it about? That's for all of us to work out. It is no one person's job to figure that out. But we have got to be in better relationship with each other in order to do that hard work. We have got to be in better relationship with each other across our differences. How do we do that kind of work? Back here a little bit. So this is a story, and I have to look down a little bit because it's not my story, and it's a quote that I always want to read as another example of something that happened just a couple of years ago. And I like to share this because it was shared with me on Facebook. It was shared with a lot of people on Facebook, and I want to share this. So some of you may have heard of the fantastic organization Girl Trek. It was started in 2012 by Vanessa Garrison and Morgan Dixon. It is the largest nonprofit in the country that focuses on Black women's health. And one of the areas of focusing on that health is getting Black women in the outdoors. You can see pictures here, hiking, walking, outside, really enjoying it. And Vanessa sent this. She had taken a group of women into Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado a couple of years ago, and she posted this after that. And I'm going to read her short piece that she posted for people to read, so you have an idea of what she experienced. When I have a little more time to clear my head, I'm going to write a longer piece about being pulled over in the national park while I was driving a van full of Black women down the mountain after experiencing a magical hike together. I'm going to tell you about the park police officer who approached my van with his hand on his gun and demanded I roll down the back window so he could see who's inside. I'm going to tell you how he accused me of being drunk, asked me what I was doing in the park, and then told me if I cooperated, he wouldn't give me a ticket. A ticket for what, I asked. Driving too close to the car in front of you. That's a crime in Colorado. I led 3 advanced hikes over the course of 3 days this last weekend. I've personally brought hundreds of Black women to Rocky Mountain National Park over the past 4 years. I've organized trips at every park in the country, inspired thousands of more to take a step in the great outdoors. I was on the cover of Outside Magazine. I starred in a Christmas commercial for REI, partnered with the Sierra Club to train outdoor trip leaders, was named a Yosemite National Park ambassador, and yet this man was asking me what I was doing in the park. Asked me while still holding his hand to his gun, despite seeing our hiking gear when we rolled the window down. Asked me what I was doing there as if he wasn't standing on stolen land and I was somehow trespassing. This is why I turned down opportunities to speak on diversity and inclusion in the outdoors. No, I don't want to be on your panel. No, I don't want to write an article or give a quote. No, I don't believe things are changing. Diversity and inclusion? How about decolonization and reparations? When you want to talk about that, I'll be ready. In the meantime, we'll be back to the park next year. Thinking we'll bring 1,000 Black women this time. Thinking I'll pack a fried chicken sandwich and wrap it in foil and eat it at the lake next time because I can. Thinking I'll do whatever I want because I can. Because I have a right to be there. Because you won't scare us off. I belong here. We belong here. So I tell folks, you know, that this is my metaphorical afro. I know I just dropped that, right? We can come back to it because we're going to have some time to talk about that. And I'm sure a lot of you out there may have your own stories. And I thank Vanessa Garrison for that, Morgan Dixon. This is my metaphorical afro, and right now, like a lot of you, this is what's sort of at the forefront of my mind, is the coronavirus, as well as the death of George Floyd, and more importantly, systemic racism, Black Lives Matter movement in general. But I carry a lot of people around my head, and this is just a random, bunch of people that I carry around there at all times. And some of these people, are influence my work and the way that I think and that I show up in the world. Some of them move me, and some of them get up in my head, and I wish that they weren't there. But the point being that I'm talking about very specifically African Americans and the outdoor or the environmental experience, but I am influenced by all kinds of voices and all kinds of people, like so many of us, as I think about that, right? Because I'm always thinking about our relationships to each other and how we are influenced. And just so you know, that's me in my 7th grade afro with my overplucked eyebrows. So I want to talk about a few things from my book a little bit. I borrowed from the fabulous Spike Lee in terms of a lot of my chapter titles. And that was very much on purpose, in part because when I was originally working on this as a dissertation, I could hardly find anything on the library shelves about African Americans and the environment. I could find some work on environmental justice, but like people have heard me say, Black people aren't only the bad things that happen to them in the environment. Like white people and all who are incredibly diverse, and all other kinds of people who are incredibly diverse. We are intersectional, we dream all kinds of different worlds. And I really wanted to tap into what that is. And he's made movies and films about Black culture, so I borrowed. I call this first chapter Bamboozled. Spike Lee was talking about how we've been bamboozled in the media when it comes to thinking about African-American stereotypes. For me, we've been bamboozled when thinking about the environmental narrative in this country, that whole manifest destiny, the idea that the immigrants come over, European immigrants moved across and settled and sort of grew our civilization and our culture in a very particular way. It is not that they didn't do that, but there was a cost for a whole lot of other people. There was a cost for them, for many of them, right? I admit and I understand to the best of my ability that they came over here and many of them did not want to leave their own homeland. But please remember all the Native people who've been killed and removed and are still fighting for their right to be here. 2 things, always true, no matter how far we get down the road. 1, all this land was stolen, all of it. And 2, right? We built our economy on the backbone of enslaved Africans as property, man. That's what we did. We did those 2 things. And we are still paying for that. Some of us are paying for it more than others, right? And to really understand what does that mean for us to collectively hold that for each other. I talk a lot about the question of representation. So I call this jungle fever after the fabulous Spike Lee. And I'm not talking about interracial relationships as much as I'm talking about that narrative, that dominant narrative about nature in this country. There's a way that we talk about nature as sublime and it is out there and you get renewal. It's not that that isn't true, but it really denies the complexity for what it means for different people. Everything from access to opportunity to even being able to walk, Christian Cooper, anybody, and just enjoy it in that way, that it's different. So I put up these 2 images, and some of you may remember, this is Vogue, I believe it was from 2010. And it was the first time they put a Black man on the cover. And so what you're looking at is LeBron James, the wonderful LeBron James, the supermodel Gisele Bündchen. And when this cover came out, there were a lot of Black people on social media who basically lost their minds because they were angry. They said, well, this is great. You finally put a Black man on the cover, but why does he look so primitive with his mouth open, holding this white woman? And then somebody uncovered the poster that you're seeing here. That poster is from 1917. So you're looking at those 2 there, right down to the color of her dress, right? Now, at the time, the editors and the people who put together the Vogue issue said they didn't know anything about that poster. Yes, I don't believe them, right? Maybe they were just being provocative, right? But it raises a question about historically how Black people have been caricatured when we're talking about nature. You know, we've been fighting for our full humanity for 400 years to be seen as a human being, which means if you're not human, then you're more animal, right? So it gets complicated when you start talking about connections to nature in the past. Let's jump ahead to, and I'm not trying to be political here, but just taking a sort of political moment in our history. Let's jump ahead to our first self-identified African-American president. President Obama is in the White House. And you start hearing things from our talk show hosts like Glenn Beck, a conservative talk show host, who starts talking about Obama's Planet of the Apes. When the stimulus bill came out, in New York, actually, I believe it was either the Post or the Daily News, there was a full-sized cartoon, and the cartoon was of a dead chimpanzee with a sign that says stimulus bill, 2 white cops with smoking guns standing over him. I could stand here for the next 35 minutes and just go on with all the different ways we were seeing people make these kinds of references out loud. The thing about it is there's nothing new about any of those references. The World's Fairs back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So the World's Fairs were amazing. I can imagine they were amazing, right? You know, you hear about the World's Fairs. This is where people were doing inventions and being really innovative and creative and thinking about what are we going to be like? What are we, the people, going to be like as we move into the future? They also put Black and brown people on display as the very thing that we want to move away from. The American Museum of Natural History, my favorite museum, the first museum I ever went to as a kid, and still my favorite museum, they also put somebody on display. So Otabanga was a young man from the Congo who was discovered. He was brought back here to the United States, and he was put on display at the American Museum of Natural History to be the thing that we want to move away from. I think he was supposed to be representative of the missing link. And then because the museum officials thought, well, not enough people are going to see him, so they moved him to the primate exhibit at the Bronx Zoo. Right, until enough people protested even then, and they removed him. There are a lot of stories like that at that time. When you want to think about our roots, when you want to understand why are Black people being too emotional when they see a picture like this and then see a poster like that. That is an old wound that is arguably never healed, because it is not Black people's job to heal that on their own. It has to be a collective effort of healing, which means there has to be recognition in order for there to be reconciliation. The final thing I want to say about this is, and I'm sorry, LeBron, because I do love you, is he was also complicit, because supposedly there was a whole lot of different pictures taken, including pictures of him in a suit. And I'm pretty sure he got paid for this. So I'm gonna just let that hang in the air. Yeah, there's something else I want to say, but I'll leave that for a second. 40 acres and a mule, right? Which is where the 400,000 acres comes from, this idea they got a mule in their 40 acres, Black people when they were freed. I spent a lot of time talking to Black people around the country, and the role of memory came up in a very particular way, especially for older Black people, you know, trusting their memory or their family's memory or their neighbor's memory more than trusting, say, what the government is saying or what institutions of higher learning are saying, right? And they had good reason for not trusting those places, right? Tuskegee experiments, the list is long. But a couple of things I want to talk about here is the way that memory can kind of sit with you for some time. In 2005, I lived in Atlanta, and this is when I was working on this as a dissertation. And I got my parents to come visit me. And when I always tell this story, because my dad, Henry Finney, old school, he's an old school, he's conservative, actually. And for me growing up, he was really challenging. He scared me. He was angry all the time. I understand a lot of that as an older person. I will want to say this little side note. My father's full name is, or his full name that he was born with was Henry Lee Finney. And like a lot of Black people, particularly older Black people, they understand that those names weren't descended from any original name, right, of who they are, but the name often given to their relatives, you know, their ancestors as enslaved people, right, and carry that on. But he particularly hated the name Lee because he was sure it was after Robert E. Lee. So around 2000, he asked me and my brothers, you know, can I change my name? And we said, yeah, you can do that. Here's what you have to do. He filled out the paperwork. So now my father's official name is Henry X. Finney. I know I can't see all your faces, but I got to tell you, I was proud of my dad right then. So I got my parents to come visit me in Atlanta. Now, my father has always harbored something against the National Park Service as well, because, right, he couldn't get that job. But I was like, we are going to have the Black National Park experience because we're in downtown Atlanta. It is Dr. Martin Luther King National Historic Site. I'm going to bring my parents. It's going to happen. So we went that day. And for any of you that have never gone there, it's almost like a living park, right? It's about history, but it's living. You have Ebenezer Baptist Church on that street. You have the house Dr. King grew up in on that street. People are living on that street. Cars are going on that street, right? And there's a visitor center. So we go into the visitor center and my mom wanders off. And my dad and I walk over to this diorama. The exhibit was set up as a bunch of dioramas. So images from the 50s and 60s, used black and white, some in color. There's some life-size statues of people like they're protesting. And there's all these sounds coming over the speaker. Sometimes it's Dr. King's voice, sometimes it's police, but you're just hearing it. So the idea is you are just inundated and you're having a sensory experience of what it felt like in the 50s, in the early 60s. So I'm standing with my dad in front of one of these exhibits. My dad, we are not touchy-feely family. We are not revealing anything. You know, I always tell people I was born before Oprah, so we didn't know how to where's the language to have these kind of personal and intimate conversations. We kind of just walk around in our feelings all the time. So me and my dad are standing there, and suddenly my dad grabs my arm. Now, like I just told you, we're not physical. So when he grabbed my arm, I flashed back to being like 10 and thinking I must have done something wrong, but like I was grown. So what's actually happening right now? And then I looked over at him and he had blanched. So then what I thought was happening was that he was having a heart attack. And then right after that, my father giggled. And every time I tell people that, I said, you have to understand that was more scarier than seeing him blanch because my father does not giggle. And then he pointed. And what he pointed to was a sign. And the sign that was there said, for whites only. And when he pointed to the sign, he said, it was part of the display. He said, I saw that sign, and for a minute, I thought we weren't supposed to be here. His memory had taken him back 40 years, just like that. And he was grabbing my arm to get me out. And I told this story 100, 200 times. And I'm always deeply moved by the fact that for the very first time, I saw what my father carries around, and my mother, what they carry around their whole life. My mother, I can't get her to go to an art house movie theater. And I could never understand why she never wanted to go. There was one near them in Leesburg, Virginia. And then until she said, look, I don't want to go to an art house movie theater because that reminds me of those theaters we went to as a kid and we always had to sit in the balcony in the back, you know. So to understand how, especially for older people, how they carry that around. But imagine for younger people, when something happens, like to Christian Cooper, George Floyd, there was a young girl whose name happened to be Brianna. She's 15. And this was in the news about a month ago, and she was in Florida, and in Wellington, Florida, in a wealthy, predominantly white neighborhood, but she lived there. She was a black girl with her grandfather. She was walking with two white friends, and there is a video of an older white man yelling at her saying that she doesn't belong there. Those scars run deep, right? So, you know, at one end of that continuum, you can be killed. But at the other end of the continuum, you are always walking in the kind of insecurity about not necessarily who you are. You can know who you are, but what everybody else is going to think and do about that. How are they, or do you have to defend your presence yet again? So I want to end with a couple of stories, like really positive stories of Black people who have done amazing environmental work and have their own legacy here and that show up. That we are not only, I want to emphasize this again, I'm telling you some traumatic events. I'm telling you some hard things, you know, that are hard to hear, some painful events, and the pain that gets carried around by many of us all the time. But we have full capacity for joy, you know, Black joy, all joy, right? We're creating it all the time. And that in spite of a lot of what's happened over time, you've got people who've pushed back and fought and are resilient and are continually creative and innovative. And I asked the environmental movement, the big mainstream, predominantly white movement, to say, why wouldn't you want to tap into this? And I don't mean appropriate, right? I don't mean transacted or extracted. I mean engage with the people doing this work so together we can actually create something new and different. One of these people was Mauvine Betch. Mauvine Betch grew up in a very wealthy Black family off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida, on Amelia Island. Her sister is actually quite famous, Jonetta Cole. It's a quite famous academic and brilliant. So Mauvine grew up there in the 30s and 40s and 50s so her great-great-grandfather was A.L. Lewis. He was the first man, Black or white, to have a life insurance company in Jacksonville, Florida. That's how he made his money. But even though they were wealthy, they were still Black, which meant you couldn't go to the same beaches as white people. So A.L. Lewis thought, I can't go to the same beach. What I am going to do is buy a beach. So he did. He bought a strip of beach on Amelia Island. He called it American Beach. You could be a Black judge or a Black janitor, and you could have a house on the beach. Where Mauvine is standing there is the sand dunes. And so she's looking out at the ocean. The sand dunes are behind there. This is where Mauvine grew up. Mauvine went to Oberlin College. Then she decided she wanted to be an opera singer. So she went to Germany for a few years and she had some success. Then she came back to the US and she became really interested in environmental causes. First, she was supporting a man who studied the monarch butterfly, or she would give money to environmental groups who were going to Africa. Then Mauvine decided to give all of her wealth away to environmental causes, over $750,000. Her great-grandfather's house that had been bequeathed to her, she gave it away to environmental causes. She told me at the time I met her in 2005 that she was living on a chaise lounge on the beach until her sister Jonetta came along and gave her a trailer to live in. And I said, well, weren't you scared when you were like living? You know, Mauvine wouldn't just be sitting in a folding chair. She, of course, would be on a chaise lounge if you knew her. But I still said, weren't you scared? And she said, no, I had a big stick. While Mauvine had been thinking about environmental issues beyond where she was living, she started to look at what was happening in American Beach. Now, American Beach sits in between two beach resorts, Amelia Island Plantation and Fernandina Beach. Right? So developers were chomping at their bit to think about how they could develop this beach, which would have meant cutting down some of the maritime forest, all the things that happens when you disrupt a piece of land in that way. But for Mauvine, it wasn't only about the landscape, it was also about the African-American history in that place. And she saw those two as intertwined. One of the stories that she tells me, and I often tell an audience, is to say, she said she would go to civic meetings, because you know they have those public meetings when something's about to happen. And so she said, I would go in and I would stand in the back. Now, that's what Mauvine looked like, right? That's Mauvine's dreadlocks that she's carrying underneath her arm. It's really hard for Mauvine not to be noticed. But anyway, Mauvine told it to me like she was sort of sneaking in to the back. And she said they'd be doing the Pledge of Allegiance. And she said, I would join in. I pledge of allegiance to the flag, to the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice. And then she said she'd shout out at the top of her lungs, for all white people who got money, and all. And she'd be like, and then they saw me. I said, they saw you when you walked in. Mauvine worked with the Park Service to help protect 8.2 acres of the sand dunes. She has a legacy. She's known as the Beach Lady. So if you forget her name, if you remember the Beach Lady, you can look her up online, right? There's been a film, there's been books written about her. I go around the country and sometimes out of the country talking about it, but around this country in particular, there are still a lot of environmental groups of people who've never heard of who she is. And I always wonder why that is. I want to talk a little bit about John Francis. I want to check my time and make sure, because I could just get carried away. Yeah, we're almost there. I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop after John Francis. Well, actually, you all can ask me about John Francis, because I see what time it is. I want to make sure we have a conversation about John, who spent 22 years walking across the U.S. to raise environmental awareness. 17 of those years, he did it without talking. You can ask me about him. You can ask me about how hard it was for him to initially get a book published about that until National Geographic came along. You can ask me about some of the challenges he had. You can ask me that in 1989, when Exxon Valdez happened, he was the only PhD in the country who'd done a PhD on oil spills. You can ask me about Brenda Palms Barber, who works with previously incarcerated Black men and women in Chicago, in the state of Illinois. And they actually have a company called Sweet Beginnings, where she makes honey and honey-related products. And she told me that when she started this company, that when she started this company, people thought she was crazy because you're making urban honey on the west side of Chicago, and who's going to do that? But what's really powerful about her story, there are many things that are powerful because it's incredibly successful. She said for a year she was running the green business and she had no idea because she was doing it by intuition. She was engaging with the community. She was acting local. Everybody has to know the life cycle of the bee. It doesn't matter if you went to school or not when you work in her company. But you can ask me about what it was like when she interviews one of these young and black men and women for the job. The idea, and for me, it is the primary reason why I never use the term outreach anymore, because outreach is not about reciprocity. It is about me getting to outreach to you, to bring you to my table so you can learn everything about my table, my mission statement, my culture, the way I do it, and I don't have to learn anything about you. And I'm here to tell you, when you do that, nothing changes except the person who you brought in, who has to carry the weight about that and doesn't have room to breathe and be who they are, and everybody loses, right? We can have that conversation. We can talk about, you can ask me about Christian Cooper and John Muir. I have a lot more to say about that in particular, because for me, it is not about one or the other. John Muir's experience, he was racist, yes, in his own words. He was also thoughtful. He has also influenced us. Good, bad, or ugly, it is there. It is not about his story or my story. It is about our story. And how do we stand in the tension of that and figure out what that entails and what it requires? And that we all have to do the work around our bias. And I can come back to this as well, because these images are meant to tell you stories about my own struggles. I don't have it all figured out. I have bias too. I have a hard time with that, and we can have that conversation. Ultimately, that what I want to say is about how are we willing to take a risk in order to gain something, not about taking a risk in order not to lose it. This is not about being comfortable. There is nothing comfortable about this. And so many of us have never been comfortable in the first place. If comfort is the highest goal, boy, man, we're thinking really low. That is a low bar. We want to be better. And so what does that require from us? What risks are we willing to take to get there? I'm going to stop there because I really want to hear what you all have to say. Engage with you. Thank you.
Carolyn, all I can say is that was incredible. And I know our audience feels exactly the same way because they've been sharing their thoughts on everything you've said. So powerful. The imagery is so potent and these stories are so personal and so great to be shared. And you're the best person to do it. So thank you so much from myself, from NYBG, from our audience. It's really, really excellent.
Thank you. And you can see that I have so much to say. There's never enough time because there's so much to say, but it's not all about me. So I really want to hear what people, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, if you don't mind, we've got some questions all right out the bat. I'm happy to share them. This question talks sort of about definitions that you used and laid out early in the talk. So Fred asks, if all knowledge is subjective, how can anything be self-evident?
Let me think about that for a minute. Well, so that's actually a really good and tricky question. So when I use the term self-evident, I guess I'm using it to make a case for myself and other Black people that have always, we're often, and not only Black people, who become invisible in certain conversations. And so I'm using it in a very particular way. All knowledge can be subjective, but, and I'm going to say this, Fred, and I say this gently, right? I say this gently. When people talk about white supremacy, and when they talk about whiteness, whiteness is not a bad thing. Nobody who's white can help the skin they were born in any more than myself or anyone else can help the skin they were born in. But I always like to rely on James Baldwin's idea and conception of whiteness is about power. So when why they don't seem, you know, if we're thinking logically about what is self-evident and subjectivity, but that's an intellectual, you know, we're putting that together intellectually, and I'm actually coming at self-evident from a more an emotional place as well as a historical place to understand once again, just like my family was erased, and I'm sure the people at the Westchester Land Trust are good people because they didn't have to make that case. So I believe that I can be both that my subjectivity is important. Everybody's subjectivity is important, but my subjectivity is important because if it isn't, then I am no longer self-evident to myself. I know it's a complicated thing to say, but it's like I have to, yes, they kind of grade up against each other. I'm not making a logical statement. What I'm making is kind of an emotional one. Does that make sense? It's like I'm making an emotional statement. Yeah, I'm gonna keep it there. There's more that I can say, but that was a great question, Fred. You tripped me up there, but I appreciate that. I'm gonna think about that more.
Thanks for that. We have another question from Deja. First of all, thanks you for speaking with us today, and said
Charles, I missed that. I missed that.
I mentioned many of our stories erased or covered up, such as your family's.
Charles, I can't hear you. Actually, I'm not hearing you at all now. Okay, he's cut out altogether, but I'm looking down at the chat. I'm going to see if I can figure it out. I think Charles just went away.
I'll chime in. I think I found the question.
Okay.
Thank you for speaking with us today, Dr. Finney. This has been amazing. My question is, what are some of the ways we can access and help to safeguard African-American environmental history for future generations? As you mentioned, many of our stories have been erased or covered, such as your family's history tending to the land in New York.
That's a great question. Thank you for that. So a couple of things. So I was thinking about, I mentioned her earlier, the poet Nikki Finney. We have the same last name and people often think we're related. We're related in the heart, but her work, she's a National Book Award winning poet. She's amazing. Her most recent book, earlier in the pandemic, when I was watching her on Zoom, she made me think about, she talked about African-American memory and artifacts, the artifacts for a life. So that for many of us who are African-American, in part of the work is that we need to claim and forefront those artifacts, those memories. We need to find a way to do it as well, right? We have ownership on that. And those things that we may not have found to be important or to have any value, in part because mainstream culture doesn't recognize the value it has. That's, for me, that's our work, not to look for that external affirmation about our lives, our ancestors' lives, our families' lives, our communities' lives. We can find ways to do that. Having said that, right, we don't live in isolation, right? We live and work with all kinds of people. So I really appeal to, all kinds of organizations, the media, how do you forefront Black stories? And here's what I want to say here. This is not about, there's two things I want to say here about this, because I know a lot of people are doing that right now. And, because I'm an optimist, I understand that it's a beginning and a place for a lot of people to start from. I also understand not a lot of people are buying it because they want to see what's going to happen a year from now, 5 years from now. What changes about the company or the organization beyond the fact that you printed a story or told a tale or you used an African-American, and forefronted them, right? That is the work. So I ask companies and organizations that are in these positions of power, right, to really think about what does it mean to actually change it 360. There is no bit by bit here. I mean, I know everybody's going to do what they do, but for me, it's like, actually, there's going to have to be a full turn. And again, there's not going to be anything comfortable about it. And there is something to be said about access and opportunity. Who has access and opportunity? Funding. Who gets the funding? What does that, compensation look like? What does it look like to, I'm going to say this in the most gentlest way I can, but what does it mean to only show Black people on Black History Month, right? What happens, one of the things that many of us as Black people in this country have learned, and I can say for myself, I'm not speaking for all African Americans, let me just speak for myself, is that I actually can relate to anybody. I can relate to anybody no matter what they look like. I can watch them in a movie, I identify with characters from all over, they can be different genders, I can relate to anybody, in part because I've had to learn to do that. Because if I only related to people who look like myself, there are so many things I would have never been exposed to because I've never seen us. We've never been put forward as the people doing those things, whatever that is, right? Acting in movies, climbing mountains, you know, building ships, I don't care what it is. But we've always been there doing those things, just like everybody else. So I've learned how to, across those differences, you know, point to characters that I'm like, oh yeah, I relate to that person. Doesn't matter if they're white or Chinese or where they're from. The thing in this country that I think is often challenging for many who consider themselves white is that they haven't had to do that. So, you know, I always talk about the movie Hunger Games when it came out. And if you know the first episode, the first film of Hunger Games, right, with Katniss Everdeen and the young Black character, the little girl named Rue, I believe she was 6 years old. And I hope I ain't giving nothing away because I hope you all have seen it. But, you know, Rue doesn't make it, right? But Katniss and Rue go really close. Do you know that the social media went crazy? White people went crazy. Why was she Black? And this happens all the time. It's like they couldn't, you know, it wasn't about the relationship between her and Katniss. It wasn't the fact she was a little girl who died. They just couldn't get over it, and they were angry about the fact she was cast as Black. What is the work that we have to do? So promoting Black stories, not only as Black stories, but as stories. They're human stories. And I'm not talking about kumbaya erasing the difference. I'm talking about asking us all to stretch what we think humanity means, to stretch our subjectivity, our perspective, to stretch what is always going to be true. The thing I have in common with every single one of you here today is that we are all human beings. We are all human beings. I do not want to deny your humanity, and I do not want you to deny mine. So what is the work that we can do to make it possible to get there?
Fantastic. Thank you for chiming in, Raquel. Sorry, I had a brief connection loss earlier. There are so many great questions coming in. It's actually very hard to pick which ones to start with. So several folks have asked that you would speak more about Christian Cooper and John Muir. What do you think is the best way for us to continue to do this collective healing and the best ways for others to get involved, in particular, Black and people of color youth?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great two-part question. So when I go back a little, Christian Cooper, John Muir, one of the things, so, you know, a few weeks ago, when that article came out in the Washington Post about Sierra Club John Muir being racist, it's something a lot of us have been saying a long time. You know, the thing is, John Muir wasn't only racist. He just made some real racist statements in a lot of his work. One of the things I've learned over time from his family, actually, is that he evolved. You know, I am not a big fan of cancel culture because cancel culture is way too easy, right? If we start canceling everybody who's done something wrong, there ain't gonna be nobody left, right? And for me, there's no healing that happens there. So really, but I'm not saying accountability isn't a thing. Accountability is a thing, right? But we can work about what that is, right? When that article came out, the great-great-grandson of John Muir, Robert Hanna, reached out to me and we did a podcast about it. And that particular podcast, I'd love to see more, was really looking at the moment that he and his family were overwhelmed. How do we think about moving forward? Part of it for me is how do we have those relationships and have those conversations? How do we get good at having those conversations? It's a skill. It's a practice. It's actually, it takes time. Because you have to build trust. It is always about relationship. I think about, one of the things I like to say about Christian Cooper is, and I haven't met Christian Cooper yet, and I only know him from what I've read and what I've heard. One of the things that others in the early days of that story, when they were talking about Christian Cooper, they kept putting forth that he was Harvard educated, that he was sitting on the board of Otabanga, which is one of our, you know, most popular in terms of well-known environmental organizations in this country. And what was bothering me about it is not about his achievements. I thought that's fantastic. But what was bothering me about it was that it's getting promoted like this really shouldn't have happened to him because he went to Harvard and sits on Audubon. You know what? If he had been homeless with not a dime in his pocket, it shouldn't happen to have happened to him either. That's the point. It's actually, your worth is not bequeathed by what you have achieved in the world. And I know not everybody is going to agree with me because we live in a country that looks for that external affirmation before making our own decisions about what we should affirm as being worthy and of value. So for me, this is a kind of fearlessness that's needed about what is of value to you. So if we're working with youth, if we're working with anybody, what is of value? Who do you stand with? What are you willing to risk? Because this, folks, is the territory of where you are losing jobs, where you will lose friends, where you will lose membership within certain communities, where you are risking, right? And I'm not saying everybody should do all those things. I can't tell anybody else what to do. I can only, look in the mirror and talk to myself. But I'm saying, and I think of youth, and there's a lot of great youth opportunities. Greening Youth in Atlanta is the first thing that comes to my mind, run by Angelo Azilio, right? Works with youth. There are a lot of organizations, Outdoor Afro, oh my God, Jose Gonzalez would kill me, who started the organizations for Latinx people. There are so many organizations that are working with youth. And so we can look at how do we better support those organizations? How do they get the resources that they need? If we ask any of those people to speak for us and work for us and do workshops, how do we compensate them? What does it mean to help self-promote? But also, what does it mean to work better in a relationship with them? How do we change that power dynamic that has often been like this when you talk about anything environmental in the country in terms of the organizations that have a lot of the funding, the political access, and the opportunity? It doesn't mean for me to get rid of them. It just means, like, how do we adjust it a little bit more and think differently about what that power dynamic is? The youth are watching. They're watching all the time about what the rest of us are doing, right? So for me, it's issues of authenticity, transparency. Again, not about transaction and extraction. How do you get real within your company, within your community, within your family? What does that look like? I'm just going to say it. If you're a white person and you're talking to a Black friend or a Latinx friend or someone at this moment, what does that real conversation look like, right? Because that's, for me, one of the things that's so powerful about youth, who are very diverse, is their fearlessness in saying exactly what's on their mind. And I know sometimes some of us are older are just going, they haven't thought that through, they're young, we want to dismiss that. But for me, there's always truth there. And there's something really vivid and powerful that a lot of us, as we get older and comfortable, forget. That change does not happen just because we want it to be so. It happens because we make it so. And make it so happens because we're willing to risk in order to get there. Ooh.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carolyn, so much.
Yeah.
So Max asks, I'm very used to hearing about positive aspects of a conservation easements and the benefits for ecosystems, etc., but I haven't heard much about their ability to erase histories before. Do you know of alternative approaches to honoring both human and natural histories on conserved land, or ways to better approach these histories on land already under easement?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've never been asked that before. So I think a lot about this. Part of it is, how do we take the time to do the homework? So what's true about that land? My parents weren't the first people there. The Tishmans weren't the first people there. There were Native people on that land. I mean, if we really want to do our homework, we're going to be digging deep to understand what is the history of that land over time. What does it tell us about the people on that land that were there? What does it tell us about ourselves when we think about how that land has changed hands over time? An organization like the Westchester Land Trust, for me, I'm sure they didn't even think about it. I don't know that they even knew that. you can do everything from, there's oral histories, there's ways to tell and get used to what does it mean to tell a fuller story of. There are members of the Finney family who can do that for you. There are members, I mean, there's a way to talk about story and place. It is not just only about environmental science or environmental history, both which are incredibly important, right? But if we're going to tell a full multidimensional picture, you know, I think a lot about, I don't even know if it's true, but we talk about that people and bodies get to be intersectional. I think places are too, right? I think there's a pluriverse of things happening right in one place. How do we get better about embracing what that is? And so what new skill sets do we have to acknowledge? How do we get better at storytelling? And I'm not talking about simply telling anecdotes which get dismissed in a hierarchy of knowledge, right? If it's not science in this way, then it can't count down here, but actually thinking about it more circular and relational. That how they both feed into each other and give us a fuller picture, not only of the land, but a fuller picture of who we are as well as who we can be. So I think organizations can do that work, and they will tell you they don't have enough money, they don't have enough time. You know, those are just choices. I'm not saying it's easy, but those are just choices. And we can always make a different choice.
Thank you, Carolyn. I think that speaks to all of us and the choices that we make in the future that we can come to create by forming those relationships that you talked about, which are so important.
Yeah.
Carolyn, there are so many more questions, but we have to respect your time. And
I can take one more.
Viewers, would you like to take one more?
Yes, come on now. We're just warming up. No, one more, yes.
Okay. So I think this talks a little bit to something that you were just discussing. When thinking along the lines of inclusion and partnership, institutions, organizations often forget that reciprocity is key, that they will need to give something to get something.
Yes.
What do you believe are the things that institutions must be willing to give in order to truly be inclusive partners of Black, Indigenous people of color, reclaiming of historical lands and heritage?
Dang, that's a good question. Okay, so when I was at UC Berkeley, this was back in 2007, 2008, 2009, President Clinton came to give a talk there, and he was free and we're all there, and I was sitting up in the balcony, and he said a lot of things, but the thing that really stuck with me is that he said for countries in the global South, the big issue is infrastructure. They need to focus on their infrastructure. But for countries like the US, he says, our biggest challenge is the rigidity of our institutions. The rigidity of our institutions. I wrote that sucker down. I was like, that's it. So I think about the role of institutions, academic, political, all the, our museums, you know, institutions in many ways, you know, it was a place to begin, a place to sort of create a container for information and opportunity, a place for creating containers for memory, right? And I can really respect that. I really can. And I understand that pretty much just about every single institution in this country when it was created wasn't created for people who look like me. And that's just true. And some of that has changed over time, absolutely. But we're still looking at these institutions. You know, I'm thinking of the art, you know, for artists, for the literary institutions, all of them, and we're still having a similar story in all of them, and who we're seeing in there mostly, who we're seeing supported mostly. So one of the things I think that institutions can do if they're not already doing it is, what does it mean to, first of all, do some internal work? How do you get real at home? And what does that really look like? What are you willing to let go of? Right? And power is a hard thing for people to give up. You know, it's a hard thing, right? Privilege is a hard thing. We all have privilege. We all just don't have the same privilege in the same way, right? So understanding for me, what can institutions do? They have to be doing some homework about who they are, because I want to remind everyone that it is not the job of Black and brown people to do all that work for the institution. Which doesn't mean that those of us that choose to show up and labor in that way shouldn't do that work in relationship, right? Institutions start to look at everything, including their bottom line. You know, if I hear one more significant institution say they don't have the funding to do this work, I'm really like, my eyes are going to roll back in my head, because then you look at the institution, you're going, but look what you do. That's why this is hard. If it takes funding, then you have to allocate the funding, right? You have to make that choice. When you look at your leadership, what does that mean? And I have examples of people that are doing that. I just don't want to call the organizations out, but they are actually making an effort to figure out, and that this is going to take time. It is not a goal, it is a process, and it is a practice, and it is ongoing, right? We will build trust over time. There are a lot of us out there, out here, out there, right, who are showing up every day because we want to, because we believe in this. You don't have to convince us. We are not empty vessels waiting to be filled with your knowledge, which isn't to say that we don't have things to learn, but so do you. So how do we come to the table together and create that table for ourselves, right? So this isn't just a moment. Black Lives Matter isn't just a moment. February isn't just about Black History Month. This is about all of us. This isn't on Black people. This is on everybody. So start at home. Start with your own organization, the institution itself. Push back on everything from who gets promoted and who doesn't, who gets chosen and who doesn't, whose work gets put forth and whose doesn't. You know, and it gets complicated because then we get into conversations about what is rigorous, right? Rigorous is about intention and attention to intention. There isn't only one kind of rigor. You don't have to write in just one way. You don't have to use words in just one way. You don't have to sing in one way. You don't have to just make in one way, right? There's many ways to do it and to do it well. And I'm all about doing it well. Right? So it's about bringing rigor to the table. And when you, as an institution, don't know how to recognize that rigor, you hire somebody who can help you out with that. And you take a risk. And remember, it is not about assimilation. Something I've been saying lately is, look, institutions have built a lot of work and time. I'm not saying throw it all away. I'm saying you don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but you sure do need a new bathtub. And so, and you don't have to create that on your own, right? There should be buy-in, there should be engagement, something beyond transaction and extraction. Communities and individuals are tired of thinking that the only way that they're going to get their work noticed, their voice noticed, their piece of land noticed, their place noticed is by selling themselves out. We should never have to sell ourselves out. Nobody should have to do that. I could keep going on that one, but yeah.
Powerful. Preach. Those are the words that we're hearing from the audience right now, and including one nomination for president, I think, for you. So
2 nominations.
2 nominations for president. That should be enough. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Carolyn.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to everybody who participated today, everybody who stayed on and asked the questions. Really, my favorite part of this is these conversations, because I'm only so sad that this isn't in person. I'm sad I can't see all your faces, but I trust that you are there with your energy, that you're showing up, that you're showing up, that you're showing up. I am an incredible optimist right now. So for everything that I'm saying, all the emotion that's there, please understand, I believe in us. I have complete faith that we can actually do this thing. And I know that it's going to be really hard. So I really appreciate you giving me the space and the time, the folks at the New York Botanical Garden doing this. This is just the beginning, folks. This is just the beginning.
I agree. And thank you again from all of us at the garden for your attendance today. It means so much to us to have you here. I just want to remind everyone that a recording has been made and will be shared online on the New York Botanical Garden lecture library for everyone who's interested. On September 25th, please join us for our next program. The title of that will be The Flora of East Central Amazonia, a report on the impacts of climate change. So another important topic that is pressing in our times. This is presented by Benjamin Tork, Associate Curator of NYBG's Institute of Systematic Botany. So I'll throw these links into the chat for everyone, and I'll say goodbye. Until then, please stay well, stay green, and take care, everyone who's out there.
Take care.